Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com, and this is anti-war news for Friday, October 28th, 2022. First story at the top of antiwar.com. More bad news for diplomacy. The White House says that only Zelensky gets to decide when negotiations will happen. So the White House said on Wednesday that it sees no prospects for negotiations between Russia and Ukraine and that it's up to Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, to decide when talks will happen. So this is from National Security Council spokesman John Kirby. He said, quote, neither side is in a position to sit down and negotiate, end quote. He said that if and when it comes to the table, Zelensky, quote, gets to determine when that is. He gets to determine what success looks like, and he gets to determine what he is not willing to negotiate with the Russians, end quote. So Kirby's comments are the latest confirmation that the U.S. has no interest in pursuing diplomacy with Russia, despite Biden's recent warnings that there is a greater risk of nuclear Armageddon today than at any time since the height of the Cold War, since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Russia has recently signaled that it is willing to hold talks, with the Kremlin saying that its goal in Ukraine can be achieved through negotiations. But Zelensky has shown no interest in talks. In response to Russia's annexation of the Ukrainian territories that it controls, Zelensky signed a decree ruling out talks with Russia while Vladimir Putin is president, essentially calling for regime change in Moscow before negotiations can happen. So that's Zelensky's position, and that's the position that the U.S. says it's supporting. And they're saying he's the one that gets to set the goals, and Ukraine's war goals are to drive Russia out of all the territory it's captured since February 24th, as well as Crimea, which has been under Russian control since 2014. Now, it's possible that the prospect of losing Crimea could be viewed by Moscow as an existential threat, which could be enough justification to use nuclear weapons under their military doctrine. Although Putin said Thursday, we'll get into this in another story, that he won't use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. But this is just where we're at. This is just more of a sign that this war is there's no end in sight for this war. It's going to drag on for years and years, it seems like, unless there's a real change. And really, I believe it's up to the U.S., to Ukraine's biggest backer, to push for diplomacy, or it's just not going to happen. And there's virtually no calls in Washington for diplomacy with Russia from Congress or anybody. This was really demonstrated by that letter that was sent to President Biden. 30 House Democrats, a group of progressives, sent him a letter basically saying they support everything he's done up to this point, but maybe we should start talking about negotiations. And they actually did say direct talks with Russia. And they said some things about what a framework for a ceasefire could be, floated sanctions relief as an idea. But no, they got all this backlash for it, and they retracted the letter and blamed it on the staff. It's released, just completely spineless. But that goes to show, even just like a little timid attempt at calling for talks just gets shut down that quickly. I mean, it's just amazing. So it's just not a good situation, and this is just more confirmation. And you go back earlier in the war, we know that Boris Johnson went over to Ukraine in April after Russia and Ukraine were holding peace talks, and that seemed to make some progress, and he discouraged the negotiations. And you go back earlier, before the current war in Ukraine, there were the Minsk Accords that were drawn up to end the war in the Donbass that was going on from 2014 until the time Russia invaded. And under those accords, Ukraine would have had to give autonomy to the Donbass separatists, but they would have remained part of Ukraine. And Zelensky actually ran on ending that war and a rapprochement with Russia, but he needed U.S. backing for that to happen, and it didn't happen. So, just as we go on here, there's just less and less chance for peace. All right. So the next one here, Western officials finalizing plan for a Russian oil price cap. So this U.S. and other Western officials are finalizing a plan to impose a price cap on Russian oil, despite warnings that attempting to implement the policy could send global prices skyrocketing. And this is according to a report from Reuters that they're working on finalizing the details. So a final price has not yet been determined, but one person told Reuters that it could be between $63 and $64 per barrel, which is a historical average for crude. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, she's really pushing this idea, she previously said that a price cap of around $60 would be enough for Russia to keep producing oil. But Russia has warned that it will retaliate against the price cap, and the plan also relies on the cooperation of China and India, who have both become major purchasers of Russian oil, and it relies on the cooperation of all of Russia's oil customers. And if Russia retaliates by slashing oil production, JP Morgan Chase analysts, as well as other analysts and experts, have warned that it could send prices, as JP Morgan analysts put it, to a stratospheric level. Because, Russia is such a major oil producer. If they really slash the amount of oil that they're putting out there, it's really going to have an impact on things. And despite this risk and this just obviously bad idea, the U.S. and its allies are planning to impose the cap on December 5th, and a final price is going to be set in the coming weeks. Bloomberg reported that U.S. officials were forced to scale back on the price cap plan due to skepticism from investors and other market issues, but a Biden administration official says that they're still going through with the plan. This is National Security Council spokeswoman Adrienne Watson said, quote, "The White House and the administration are staying the course on implementing an effective, strong price cap on Russian oil in coordination with the G7 and other partners," end quote. So the World Bank on Wednesday, they said this. They also kind of warned that the plan probably isn't going to work. They called it an untested mechanism that could reduce the flow of oil from Russia. And that in order for the plan to be effective, the World Bank said that it needs the participation of developing countries and emerging markets. So, it seems like they're pretty set on it. It could be a total disaster. All right, the next one here, Scholz and Macron, the German and French leader, they threaten trade retaliation against Biden. So France and Germany, this is from Politico EU. France and Germany want to negotiate with Washington about unfair competition, but they are ready to hit back if necessary. So Scholz and Macron haven't been too happy with themselves, with each other lately. They've had a little public spat, but recently they found something that they agree on. And this is from the article, mounting alarm over unfair competition from the U.S. and the potential need for Europe to hit back. So the German chancellor and the French president, they discussed their joint concerns during a nearly 3.5 hours of talks over lunch in Paris on Wednesday. They agreed that recent American state subsidy plans represent market distorting measures that aim to convince companies to shift their production to the U.S., according to people familiar with their discussions. And that is a problem they want the European Union to address. So the message from the lunch is that if the U.S. doesn't scale back, then the EU will have to strike back. Similar incentive schemes for companies will be needed to avoid unfair competition or losing investments. The move would risk plunging transatlantic relations into a new trade war. So this is just interesting, because as the U.S. is really counting on these countries to go along with all the Ukraine stuff, and it doesn't seem like they're going to change that anytime soon. But this is, something that could definitely affect relations and, this unity that President Biden is always talking about. All right, the next one here. Putin says that Russia would not use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So Putin said this on Thursday, and that Moscow has no plans to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And he warned that the world is facing the most dangerous decade since World War II. He said, quote, "We see no need for that. There is no point in that, neither political nor military," end quote. So he said that discussing nuclear weapons. And, it's good to hear him say that. He recently warned that Russia could use all of the weapons at its disposal to defend what he called its territorial integrity. And other Russian officials made clear that this includes, all the weapons at their disposal includes nuclear weapons, and that this applies to the territories that Moscow recently annexed. They said these territories are now protected under Russia's nuclear umbrella. But there has been no sign, and the U.S. has said this, that Putin has made a decision to use nuclear weapons. And he said Thursday that Russia's recent talk of nuclear weapons was a reaction to remarks from Western officials. So I've seen, a lot of people, of course, I'm not talking about like the mainstream Western media here. They've really overblown, I think, what Putin said, but I've kind of seen the other side of people really try to downplay it. But I still think what he said, when he was annexing these territories was a pretty major warning. And it showed the danger of what we're dealing with here, funding this war, especially when you talk about them trying to take back Crimea. This is how serious it is to Russia that they're saying they could potentially use nuclear weapons to defend this territory. But here we have Putin saying that he would not use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So I think it's just good to hear, with all this talk of nuclear weapons flying around. But he discussed a wide range of things. It was during a speech at the Valdai Club, which is a Moscow-based think tank, foreign policy speech that he gave. He discussed the current global tensions, and he said that the world is facing, quote, probably the most dangerous, unpredictable, and at the same time important decade since the end of World War II, end quote. So in the speech, he criticized the U.S. and the West for resorting to force to control other nations by using measures such as sanctions, trade wars, and backing coups. One example that he used was the U.S. assassination of Qasem Soleimani, who is the Iranian general that was killed in a drone strike in Baghdad back in January 2020. He said, quote, they killed Soleimani, an Iranian general. You can think whatever you want about Soleimani, but he was a foreign state official. They killed him in a third country and assumed responsibility. What is that supposed to mean, for crying out loud, end quote. So that's the translation of his speech from the Kremlin's website. Usually see, things translated in a few different ways when it comes to his speeches, but they're all basically saying the same thing. But yeah, I mean, the killing Soleimani assassination was just so brazen, just killing such a high level Iranian official like that. All right. So now I should mention that it is our fundraiser, but we're just about done. I mean, we're pretty much wrapped up, and Friday is the last day, and we could use just a few more donations to put us over the top. The more we go above our goal, the easier it's going to be the next time we have to do this. And this is how we have to operate. We're totally reader funded, and we really had a nice boost from some big donors, including Roger Waters, who put up $20,000 for us, which is really amazing. And posted at the top of the page today is just all the letters that we fundraising letters that we got from people, from Roger Waters, Noam Chomsky, Ray McGovern, Caitlin Johnstone, Ted Snyder, John Mearsheimer, Colonel Douglas McGregor, Kelly Vlahos, and Evans O'Brien. So just, it's really great that we had these people willing to help us raise money, because it's been really tough, the state of things with inflation and everything. I mean, people are really feeling it. So it's tough to ask people for money. So we're just thankful that we had all this help, and we're very thankful for all the donations, and for anybody that pitched in any amount of money. It's really appreciated. This goes directly to paying the staff and, paying my electric bill and things like that. We're not wasting this money or using it frivolously. So yeah, go check out those letters. And if you haven't already, go to antiwar.com/donate and pitch in. Okay, so let's see. What's the next news story we got here? This is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Russia threatens U.S. commercial satellites, aiding Ukraine's military. A high-ranking Kremlin official warned on Wednesday that commercial satellites could be viewed as legitimate targets by Moscow. Since Russia destroyed Kiev's communications infrastructure Early in the war, Elon Musk owned SpaceX has provided Ukraine with space-based internet services. So this is the deputy director of, uh, I believe, Russia's foreign ministry's non-proliferation and armed controls department. He said, quote, "I would like to draw special attention to the extremely dangerous tendency which has surfaced in the course of the developments in Ukraine. I mean the use of outer space civilian infrastructure facilities, including commercial ones, in armed conflicts by the United States and its allies. Quasi civil infrastructure may be a legitimate target for a retaliation strike. The West's actions unreasonably jeopardize the stability of the civil space activities and numerous socio-economic processes on the ground, which determine the people's well-being, first of all, in developing countries," end quote. So he said this at the UN General Assembly. Um, and he didn't name a company. Kyle points out that the thing about SpaceX, he didn't name SpaceX, but the Starlink internet service, Ukraine is really using that a lot, apparently. And also, the U.S. is providing Ukraine with intelligence, and a lot of it is satellite imagery of Russian forces. So that's definitely something he's referring to as well here. Um, all right, so let's see. The next one, China says that the U.S. must respect its concerns to resume military dialogues. So China on Thursday responded to a U.S. call for the resumption of military communication channels that Beijing suspended in response to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan in August. So China suspended a few channels of communication, military channels of communication. I believe there were more lower level sort of conflict deconfliction lines like that they suspended. There are other lines of communication open, but there hasn't been many talks between the militaries. So the U.S. has been calling to resume this, and Tan Kefi, he is a spokesman for the Chinese Defense Ministry. He said that the U.S. he said that the U.S. was responsible for the channels being suspended and that Washington must respect China's concerns for them to be resumed. After Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, again, just repeating myself here, that they suspended these channels. But there has been some communication, and earlier this month, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin spoke with his Chinese counterpart, the Chinese defense minister, and the two military leaders agreed that communication was important. Austin has said that the Pentagon is working to reestablish the channels that were suspended. But at the same time, the U.S. is looking to significantly increase support for Taiwan, despite Beijing's warnings over the issue. They suspended it over Pelosi's visit, which they saw as a brazen violation of the One China policy. So while Austin says they want to restore communication, it doesn't seem like they're listening to China when it comes to their concerns and what Tan, the Chinese Defense Ministry spokesman, called their red lines. He said the U.S. needs to understand China's red lines. So with the U.S. military presence in the South China Sea and around Taiwan, less communication between the two militaries increases the risk of an accident. And with U.S.-China relations at their lowest point in decades, an accident can spiral into something much bigger. And there's a precedent for this back in, it was 2001, before 9/11. A U.S. spy plane crashed into a Chinese military plane near Hainan Island, the Hainan Island incident, if you want to look it up. And I believe the Chinese pilot was killed. The Americans survived. And the Bush administration kind of settled it pretty quickly. But imagine something like that happening today. Who knows what that could turn into? All right, the next one here, the Pentagon releases national defense strategy that names China as top threat. So the Pentagon on Thursday released its 2022 national defense strategy, and it names China as, this is how they put it, the most comprehensive and serious challenge to U.S. national security. And this is even as the U.S. is spending tens of billions on a proxy war with Russia. So the National Defense Strategy, it was first briefed to Congress back in March, and a short summary was released, and I covered this at the time, that said China was the top threat facing the U.S. And the strategy named Russia as a close second, calling it an acute threat, but not as serious in the long term as China. So Lloyd Austin on Thursday told reporters, he had a press conference about this, he explaining why China is the top threat. He said, quote, "Unlike China, Russia can't systematically change the United States over the long term. But Russian aggression does pose an immediate and sharp threat to our interests and values," end quote. So the strategy this really struck me, and I think it's just because I was a child of the post 9/11 era. I was 11 years old when 9/11 happened, so pretty formative years. I just remember all the scaremongering about terrorist attacks and stuff. But this strategy says now that China and Russia pose a greater threat to the U.S. homeland than any terrorist groups. They're saying China and Russia pose the biggest threat to the homeland, which just sounds absurd to me. I mean, the idea of China and Russia attacking us. But the strategy said, quote, "The scope and scale of threats to the homeland have fundamentally changed. The PRC, that's China, and Russia now pose more dangerous challenges to safety and security at home, even as terrorist threats persist," end quote. So the strategy named other persistent threats, including North Korea and Iran, and what they call violent extremist organizations such as ISIS and Al Qaeda were at the bottom of the list. They were again, it's just interesting. And, you really saw this. So, this is the 2022 National Defense Strategy. The last one was released in 2018 under the Trump administration. And that outlined the shift away from counterterrorism toward what they call this great power competition with Russia and China. And fast forward 4 years later, and we're in this mess after the Pentagon decided that was going to be their focus. We're in this mess where we're funding this war on Russia's border, and tensions are just soaring over Taiwan. The strategy said that these terrorist groups had their capabilities degraded, but they may be able to, as they put it, reconstitute them in short order. So the strategy focuses on the need for deterrence to prevent a conflict with two nuclear armed powers at the same time, and it focuses on the idea of a nuclear deterrent. And the NDS was released simultaneously with the Nuclear Posture Review and the Missile Defense Review. Officials told Stars and Stripes that the documents were integrated together for the first time. And the Nuclear Posture Review emphasizes the call for the modernization of the U.S. nuclear triad. And if they go through with all these modernization plans, it could cost up to $1.5 trillion. So they need the threat to justify that, and they have definitely, really made that the priority over the years now, is China and Russia. Okay, so next one here. Israel threatens to ramp up strikes in Syria. So this is from Jason Ditz. So after carrying out 3 attacks on Syria in the past week, Israel issued a statement Thursday threatening even a further ramping up of strikes against Syria going forward. So they they sent a message to Damascus that they will increase strikes on Syria if they keep. Their accusation is that because there's Iranian weapons are being transferred to the country. So that's kind of how Israel frames all of these attacks on Syria, is as attacks on Iran. And they're saying Iran is sending weapons there that they then transfer to Hezbollah, and they're telling Syria to stop. But even if, it's just, who knows how much truth there is to Israel's accusation. Syria is an ally of Iran. Iran has military advisors there. But, they often kill Syrian soldiers, civilians sometimes. They hit civilian infrastructure, like the airports that they've taken out. And then they justify that saying, oh, it's weapons shipments. But you just think about all the American weapons that are shipped into Israel, as Jason points out here. If like weapons shipments and weapons trafficking is your issue, the biggest arms supplier in the region, to Israel and the Saudis and all the Gulf states, it's not Iran. But so we're probably going to see more Israeli airstrikes. And another one, we might see some more U.S. airstrikes in Somalia. This last one here, the U.S. considers stepping up drone strikes in Somalia. So this is based on a report from the New York Times, and it says that the U.S. is considering expanding drone strikes in Somalia after a request was made by the U.S.-backed Mogadishu-based government. The Somali government asked the U.S. to loosen restrictions on drone strikes so more can be carried out against al-Shabaab. Under the current policy that was recently formalized by President Biden, strikes in Somalia, they either need to be justified in self-defense, or what they call self-defense, of the U.S. or its partner forces, or they need to be approved by the White House. Or actually, as a it's either that, or it could be somebody that's on a kill list that's been approved by President Biden. So the U.S.-backed government recently launched an offensive against al-Shabaab, and there's been heavy fighting between them. And the government has also employed the help of some local militias, and U.S. drone strikes have become more frequent. So far, the U.S. has launched 11 known airstrikes in Somalia in 2022. 10 were done in the name of defending the Somali government, and one targeted a senior al-Shabaab leader, Abdullah Nadir, who was on a kill list approved by President Biden. U.S. official told The Times that the Somali government request is asking for the U.S. to loosen the definition of self-defense strikes or declare certain areas of Somalia as active war zones. If the areas are considered war zones, the U.S. can launch attacks against al-Shabaab members at any time. The official said that the request is being considered by the Pentagon and hasn't yet been presented to the White House with a recommendation. Earlier this year, the White House complied with the Pentagon's request to send more troops into Somalia, and President Biden deployed 450 soldiers into the country. That was back in May. Before the recent escalation, U.S. airstrikes significantly declined in Somalia under President Biden. In 2021, 11 strikes were reported by AFRICOM, U.S. Africa Command. So 11 strikes in 2021. There's been 11 strikes in 2022. But back in 2021, 7 of those strikes took place in the final weeks of the Trump administration, from January 1st to the 19th. So they were really getting their last licks in there. I guess maybe they assumed Biden was going to tone down the air war there. So AFRICOM, just to give you a reference, for the past few years, Trump really ramped up the bombing campaign in Somalia. He loosened the rules of restriction. In 2020, AFRICOM reported 52 airstrikes, 63 in 2019, 47 in 2018, and 35 in 2017. That's just AFRICOM airstrikes, and the same goes for today. There could be CIA airstrikes going on that we don't know about. Usually we'll find out about those later when some of the monitoring groups like Air Wars release reports. They compile data based on the ground, people reporting stuff on the ground, and the government statements. And they usually get a pretty good idea of exactly how much the U.S. is bombing these countries that it bombs. Just based on what the Biden administration has been doing when it comes to Somalia, they're just kind of nodding along to the escalations that they've been asked to make. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see more drone strikes in Somalia, unfortunately. But that's it for the news for today. We have a lot of great viewpoints, including one from Ray McGovern, because Friday, the October 28th, it marks 60 years, since 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the U.S. and Russia stepped back from the brink. And we could definitely learn a lesson from that today. So, again, we're just finishing up our fundraiser, antiwar.com/donate. If you like the show, tell your friends about it, share it, like and subscribe on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey if you want the video, audio, download it wherever you listen to podcasts. You can leave reviews and do all that. That stuff helps too. I should probably be better at telling people to do things like that. But that's it for me for today. That's it for the week. I'll be back after the weekend to catch you up on the news. Thanks for listening.